This is the seventh file of Roth Part 3, and it is intended that this be viewed in conjunction with Part 2. In response to the British first bombing the Germans retaliated a couple of months later and bombed London in what was called the Blitz, which was between 1940 and 1941. During this time, more than 1 million London houses were destroyed or damaged, and more than 40,000 civilians were killed. Now, these people would never have died during World War I, but because of the development of aerial warfare, now we're at the time of World War II, all those that dwelled safely in the Isles back at home were now within reach of this terrible Vial of Roth. Later in the war, after the Luftwaffe had been destroyed, came the V1 attacks launched on England, the V designating vengeance weapon. The first was launched at London on the 13th of June 1944, and at its peak, more than 100 V1s a day were fired at southeast England, 9,521 in total, decreasing in number as the sites were being overrun by the Allied forces until October 1944, when the last V1 site in range of Britain was overrun by the Allies. After this, the V1s were directed at the port of Antwerp and other targets in Belgium, with 2,448 V1s being launched. The attack stopped only a month before the war in Europe ended, with the last launch site in the Low Countries overrun on 29th of March 1945. And let's be balanced. The terrible killing of unarmed civilian populations and the needless destruction of cities which had no military significance at all went both ways. The British and Allied forces don't have the high moral ground in this area, probably in no area that pertains to war. In this instance, in World War II, they bombed the living daylights out of unarmed civilians and absolutely devastated their cities. In this article from rarehistoricalphotos.com we read, Berlin after the war was a post-apocalyptic world. One of the largest and most modern cities of Europe was left a wasteland. The city was bombed by the RAF Bomber Command between 1940 and 1945, by the United States 8th Air Force between 1943 and 1945, and the French Armée de l'Air between 1944 and 1945 as part of the Allied campaign of strategic bombing of Germany. It was also attacked by aircraft of the Red Air Force, being the Soviets, especially in 1945 as the Soviet forces closed on the city. British bombers dropped 45,517 tons of bombs. The Americans dropped 23,000 tons. In this article dealing with the bombing of Germany between 1940 and 1945, we read, in World War II, approximately 410,000 German civilians, remember these are non-combatants, these are innocent people, 410,000 German civilians were killed by Allied air raids. From July 1944 to January 1945, an average of 13,536 people were killed every month. In Hamburg alone, about 49,000 civilians were killed by Allied bombing, and in Berlin, about 35,000. The same article continues, even small villages had no reason to feel safe. They were attacked too, either by accident, as substitutes for another target, or because of local industry. So we see great hail from heaven, the cities of the nations falling, and now nowhere is safe anymore. Concerning the bombing of Hamburg by the Allies, we read, the attack during the last week of July 1943, called Operation Gomorrah, and it was called Gomorrah because of the fire and brimstone that God rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Allies were about to try and duplicate this by dropping high explosive, incendiary, phosphorus and napalm bombs onto a civilian population. This created one of the largest firestorms raised by the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces in World War II, killing 42,600 civilians and wounding 37,000 in Hamburg and virtually destroying most of the city. The resulting firestorm was a 1,500-foot high tornado of fire with hurricane force, which blew the hats off the people and sucked up small children into it. It basically wiped the city from the map. And then there is also the famous and terrible bombing of Dresden, and we read about this from Britannica.com, which says, bombing of Dresden during World War II, Allied bombing raids on February 13th to the 15th, 1945, that almost completely destroyed the German city of Dresden. The raids became a symbol of the terror bombing campaign against Germany, which was one of the most controversial Allied actions of the war. Before World War II, Dresden was called Florence on the Elbe and was considered one of the world's most beautiful cities because of its architecture and art treasures. Having never previously been attacked in the war, the city offered increased value for terror bombing against an inexperienced population. On the night of February 13th, the British Bomber Command hit Dresden with an 800-bomber air raid, dropping some 2,700 tons of bombs, including large numbers of incendiaries. Aided by weather conditions, which were quite dry at the time, a firestorm developed, incinerating tens of thousands of people. It's almost hard to imagine going through such a thing, where this massive firestorm develops and melts the population away, incinerates tens of thousands of people. The US 8th Air Force followed the next day with another 400 tons of bombs and carried out yet another raid by 210 bombers on February 15th. It is thought that some 25,000 to 35,000 civilians died in Dresden in the air attacks, though some estimates are as high as 250,000, given the influx of undocumented refugees that had fled to Dresden from the Eastern Front. The city was full of refugees fleeing from the war, and there they were caught up in this massive firestorm. And it says most of the victims were women, children, and the elderly. And we can see here the terrible horror of war, specifically what has come through aerial warfare, and perhaps what is even more shocking, that this was perpetrated by the Allies. As terrible as things had been in Europe, they were about to go to a whole new level elsewhere. The Axis powers were defeated in Europe in May 1945, and with Europe out of the way, that only left the Japanese Empire to contend with in the Pacific, and even towards the end of World War II, Japan still occupied a significant number of countries. To defeat Japan island by island may have taken the Allies years, but at this point in time, a new and even more dreadful weapon of destruction was being engineered in America. Trinity was the code name of the first detonation of a nuclear weapon. It was conducted by the United States Army at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, as part of what was called the Manhattan Project. And with this, the world was thrust into the atomic age. And how was this new weapon going to be delivered? It was going to be delivered from the air. Little Boy was the code name for the atomic bomb dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on 6 of August 1945 during World War II by the Boeing B-29 Superfortress Enola Gay. Fat Man was the code name for the atomic bomb that was detonated over the Japanese city of Nagasaki by the United States on 9th of August 1945. It was the second of only two nuclear weapons ever used in warfare. The results of dropping those two bombs was unimaginable destruction of the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and this brought an immediate end to the war. These two cities were almost entirely vaporized and blown from the face of the earth. There were not many ruins left, only rubble and dust. We are talking about the angel pouring out his vial of wrath into the air, and great hail falling from heaven, and the cities of the nations falling, and every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. These islands and mountains are symbolic of the removal of nations and kingdoms, and this is what we are seeing before us now. Within the first 2 to 4 months of the bombings, the acute effects killed 90 to 166,000 people in Hiroshima and 60 to 80,000 in Nagasaki, with roughly half of the deaths in each city occurring on the first day. And in this slide we see a victim's imprint as a permanent shadow from the heat of the explosion, as this poor person and the ladder that was next to him were vaporized in a moment during the heat of the atomic explosion. This is truly awful. Most unfortunately, it does seem quite clear that prior to dropping these atomic weapons, the Allies were actually aware of the Japanese trying to surrender about 3 weeks beforehand, and they ignored this and went ahead and dropped the bombs anyway. Terrible. The story concerning this is detailed by the famous and somewhat controversial World War II historian David Irving in his book called Churchill's War. You can also see him speak about it in videos, and it is also on his website, which we've quoted here, fpp.co.uk. And in this he says, formerly secret files in London and Washington now reveal that Japan was trying to surrender and had put out the most serious peace messages 3 weeks before the atomic bombs were dropped, and that Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and the other Allied leaders were aware of this. Further along, the writer asks the question, so why was the bomb dropped? He says, in my view, the billion-dollar Manhattan Project had gathered a momentum of its own. It was unstoppable. Too many people had an interest in seeing it used, particularly the statesmen who had pushed it and the technicians who had built it. The latter wanted it used on an as-yet undamaged target to calibrate its infernal power against real flesh and blood, against buildings and bridges. So once more, the Allies certainly have no high moral ground. However, they won the war, so they got to write the history according to their own interpretation of the events. With the end of World War II, new problems emerged. With the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the American atomic weapons in August 1945, this sparked off an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1953, and of course things kept growing from there. There are 9 nations today with atomic weapons, and the delivery systems are still primarily all by the air. Now also through things like intercontinental ballistic missiles. Since the 1970s, aerial warfare has seen the development of unmanned aerial vehicles called UAVs, or otherwise known to us mostly as drones, and initially this was for real-time surveillance, electronic warfare and decoys, but then, not surprisingly, this developed into armed drones. Nowadays, the operator of these drones can be a person sitting in front of a controlling computer system that is thousands of kilometers away from the scene of the battle. He never has to leave his seat as he rains fire and brimstone missiles and bombs down on the enemy. Unfortunately, however, drones have seen the death of many innocent civilians. In this CNN article, that is, if anyone is still listening to this channel, this news broadcaster, we read from a 2012 article called A Dangerous New World of Drones, and it says, The explosion in drone technology promises to change the way nations conduct war and threatens to begin a new arms race as governments scramble to counterbalance their adversaries. According to data compiled by the New America Foundation, more than 70 countries now own some type of drone, though just a small number of those nations possess armed drone aircraft. And bearing in mind this article was written 10 years ago, so I'm sure that that number of nations with armed drone aircraft has increased. In this recent news article we read, suicide drone that picks own target seen in Ukraine in horror AI tech breakthrough. The Kalashnikov drone can loiter over a battle zone for up to 30 minutes before identifying a target and deliberately smashing into it, detonating its high explosive payload. Noting the effectiveness of Ukraine's portable anti-aircraft missiles, military expert Samuel Bendet says the killer drones are, quote, an extraordinarily cheap alternative to flying manned missions. They are very effective both militarily and, of course, psychologically, end quote. In much more recent times, we are hearing more and more about hypersonic missiles, which go so fast that they can't possibly be shot out of the sky. And most notably, we heard recently about the Russian debut of their hypersonic missile in the Ukrainian conflict. In this article from Bloomberg.com, under the heading Hypersonic Missile Delay Puts US Further Behind Russia and China, we read a small part of a much larger story. It says, hypersonic weapons are hard to track and destroy because they fly 5 times the speed of sound and can be maneuvered. Last month, Russia debuted a hypersonic air-to-ground missile in its attack on Ukraine, and in July, China hit a demonstration target on Earth with a weapon in orbit. Coming back to Revelation 16, and in verse 18 it says, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. The reference here to voices, thunders, lightning, and a great earthquake carry the same meaning as they do elsewhere in the book of Revelation, and they tell us of tremendous change, wars and tumults. So we are looking for terrific political, social, national upheaval and turmoil, and this has really been occurring since World War I. That opened things. World War II saw even a greater escalation of these things, and there have been many wars throughout the earth since. Now, the current war between Russia and Ukraine looks set to bring the West in. Time will tell. But whatever the case is, it is causing tremendous shockwaves throughout the world. In this book, Europe, A History by Norman Davies, we read, the years between 1914 and 1945 appear as the time of Europe's troubles, which filled the space between the long peace of the late 19th century and the still longer peace of the Cold War. They may be likened to the slipping of a continental plate and to the resultant season of earthquakes. They encompass the initial military quakes of 1914 to 18, the collapse of 4 empires, the outbreak of communist revolution in Russia, the emergence of a dozen new sovereign states, the armed truce of the interwar decades, the fascist takeovers in Italy, Germany and Spain, and then the second general military conflagration of 1939 to 45. The fault line of the earthquake zone ran along Germany's eastern border. And as we have seen so many times in the past, historians use identical imagery found in Bible prophecy to describe the greatness of the events that have occurred. In this case, we are now talking about the 20th century. Now, the fact that historians use identical imagery does not prove in itself the meaning of the prophecy, but what it does demonstrate is the appropriateness of the symbolic language used to describe events which have occurred. We know the prophecy has now brought us to the 20th century, and once again we find tremendous political change and turmoil, lightnings, thunders, and earthquakes. Starting with World War I, the world was indeed rocked by an enormous earthquake, the effects of which have been felt throughout the 20th century. And in the book The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century by Winter and Baggett, we read, "The catastrophe of 1914 arose from the cumulative movement of many shifting fault lines, political, economic, cultural. The instabilities of European society were many, and they were just under the surface. When they erupted, they destroyed whole regimes, indeed, an entire way of life." Interestingly, in this same book, and speaking of apocalyptic art in Europe before World War I, it says, "Why the fever? Why the fear? Part of the story of this artistic anticipation of Armageddon is pan-European, but much of it is specifically German. These men lived in the heart of the most explosive military machine in the world." Again, we see that historians even borrow language from the Bible. Here, the word Armageddon is used, and that name comes from Revelation chapter 16 as that great gathering of the nations to battle. This book is talking about World War I, and I'm not suggesting that World War I was Armageddon in itself, but I am of the opinion that Armageddon includes World War I and World War II, and by the look of it, an even greater World War III to come, which is perhaps not too far away, as we look firstly at the European setting once more and see that it is being violently rocked by the Ukrainian war. Now, I don't possess any special knowledge to claim that the Ukrainian war will develop or trigger World War III, but many people, both secular and Christian, see that this is a distinct possibility. Over a few more pages we read, "Even after Germany's second defeat in 1945, the shadow of the Great War was still visible. Then came the shockwaves of 1989 to 91, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union." The article continues, "When the world was transformed. This earthquake ended what some have called the short 20th century. Communism collapsed, the Soviet Empire and the Yugoslav state fragmented, Germany reunited with a robust European community. For the time being, the German problem, so central to World War I, appears to be solved. Instead, other problems have emerged, disturbingly similar to those which had plagued statesmen in 1914. As I now draw this part to a close, in summary, having considered all of these things, my personal view is that we have been in the period of the seventh vial since World War I. It started slowly then and has been growing ever since, and will end with the ultimate destruction of the Babylonian succession of world empires. Perhaps that great city, divided into three parts, will be taken out as a result of aerial warfare. Perhaps it will be destroyed and overcome by the system it is upholding, the nations of the earth that it is upholding. Or perhaps there will be a great natural phenomena that will bring it to an end, or maybe it will be aspects of all of these elements that will play a part in its destruction. We will have to watch and wait, confidently knowing that it will be utterly destroyed. Praise ye the Lord. And with that, I'll end part 3 here.